I'd like to now introduce the host. Julian Butler is a Jesuit undertaking formation for Catholic priesthood. He's previously practiced law and has a degree in commerce and philosophy. Julian is a contributor at Jesuit Communications, a chaplain at Xavier College, and a board member at Jesuit Social Services. So thank you, Julian. Thanks very much, Michelle, and welcome to those who are joining us from our AC Plus community. There's a smaller number than we've had in the last couple of these, which is I only highlight to encourage those who have joined us to jump into the conversation, to feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as we go along, and we'll try and include you in the conversation and make this as conversational a session as possible. As we begin, just to introduce briefly our speakers, and I think through the course of the discussion we'll get hopefully much more of a flavour of experience and knowledge that our speakers have. But to begin by introducing Geraldine Larkins, RSJ. Geraldine is a teacher and psychologist, a sister of St Joseph. She's taught pre-service teachers at ACU, as well as having a background in classroom teaching, first in primary schools and then as an REC deputy principal. And she's had a number of roles in diocesan schools administration as well. Geraldine's current work is in formation of teachers and in lecturing at ACU, and her research interest is in children as theologians and children's aggression. So welcome, Geraldine. Nathan Ahearne, who joins us as well, works in adult formation for Marist Schools Australia. Nathan worked in his parish as a youth minister, then as a religious education teacher and leader of youth ministry at Marist College Canberra. He went on to study a Masters of Theology with a focus on practical ministry and its applications to parish, family and school partnerships. So welcome, Nathan. And Susie Harris is a former head of middle schools at a large Catholic boys' school in eastern Brisbane, and now specialises in learning support in a southern Brisbane school with the large populations of students in need of extra support. She's also a Sunday school coordinator in her local parish. Welcome, Susie. So I might begin by asking each of you, just sort of at the very kind of heart of this conversation, in thinking about how we help students discover their vocation, their call, the way that they're particularly individually called to live out their identity with the church. Just what your sense of charism or identity in the church means, and where you found yourself identifying. And it might be in one obvious place, but it might be in lots of different places as well. So as open an invitation as possible to share a little about what charism has meant to you. Geraldine, I might start with you, if that's all right.
Okay, thanks, Julian. Well, as a sister of St Joseph, my charism and my identity is very drawn or kind of connected with that Sisters of St Joseph charism, which comes from Mary MacKillop and Julian Tennyson-Woods. And I think we've recently done a bit of work around formation and come up with 4 pillars, and they are creative courage, mutual respect, conscious compassion, and intentional inclusivity. I think they probably do a pretty good job of summing up how we live our lives or how we make decisions and the strength that we have. And I think I, as a young woman, did a lot of reading about Mary MacKillop and about her story and her letters. So I read her letters and what she said about God's action in our lives. And then I had an auntie who was a mercy sister. So I did a little bit of, investigating, spending time with the mercies. And I went to a Brigidine secondary school. So I had a bit of, interaction with the Brigidine sisters. And I think it was, for me, it was a case of finding where I felt at home. So I felt a call to, and essentially the call came mainly through, I guess, in the first place from my family, and then in the second place from Teachers College, where the RE units, through the RE units, I thought, well, if I actually really believe this stuff that I'm going to teach children, that should make a difference in my life, which kind of set me off on that path of asking the question, you know, where is God calling me? What is God asking of me? So there was obviously, you know, a seed planted in primary school and secondary school, but it was really, it really didn't become particularly active until that Teachers College time. So that's probably enough of an introduction to me and my charism.
Fascinating. Thank you, Geraldine. Nathan, you're working with the Marist. Is that a particular charism you identify? What's the history been for you in discovering kind of where you particularly fit in the church?
Thanks, Julian. It's a very good question. I was going back in my mind as I was listening to Geraldine through actually going through a Marist education myself, but probably not really grasping anything about the characteristics of the spirituality until much later as a teacher. So prior to that, I think I was living the smorgasbord of Catholic life and trying everything out. And it's probably only been in the last few years that I've really deepened my awareness of that spirit that's within me. And much like Geraldine just said, and that's through learning about the founders of our Marist spirituality, and there's many of them. I won't go back through each of them, but Marcel Champagne was the one for the brothers. And I think, yeah, I was thinking about the people in my life as well that I've seen that charism move through, and the real gift that it is to the church. And I'd love to just talk all day about it. So I think it is very much a part of who I am today, those characteristics of obviously walking in the way of Mary. And even that, I remember as a young man just learning about Marian spirituality and finding very different ways and different paths, even with that part of Catholicism. So, yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell, Julian.
Susie, to you, what does sort of charism or a particular identity within the church mean for you?
We can't hear you, Susie.
Hold on, Susie. Yeah, you can.
Michael might need to unmute her.
It's the obligatory tech issue. We're getting it out of the way reasonably early. There you go.
Okay, yeah, hopefully it stays. Thank you. Yeah, so a bit like Nathan, experiencing the smorgasbord of charisms. You know, I started my whole schooling years were actually in the Sisters of St Joseph, and I was really privileged as a young person to be taught by some of those nuns, because they, for me, provided a real foundation for my faith. And there was one nun I remember in particular who used to give me little tape recordings of lots of the Catholic hymns, and I was taking those home. I really enjoyed listening to them. Then, and then I started teaching at St Pat's at Shorncliffe, which is a school, EREA, so Edmund Rice, and learning through, you know, teaching religious education, learning a lot about Edmund Rice, the man who he was. I explored that in my master's as well, which was really enjoyable. And to see what I really love is seeing it played out in the school through a lot of the outreach programs that they had. They had the Paddy's van operating, which is, you know, very well known in Brisbane. And then seeing it lived out in the classroom as well, you know, in terms of challenging, in terms of when we think about the liberating education, challenging the unjust structures in our society. So, and that's what students were inspired to do there. At Clairvaux, again, experiencing the Mary MacKillop and Edmund Rice, so they've got the blend of the two, but also in a Dominican parish, which has been, for me, was a big jump, because I'd gone to a parish where the Sisters of St. Joseph lived right next door to the main church at Nunda there. And so it was a big jump to go to a new parish and experience that. But yes, totally fell in love with the Dominican. It's been a beautiful experience, a beautiful parish, and my children are obviously in a Dominican school now. So yeah, lovely.
I must say I'm feeling, listening to particularly Nathan and Susie, very tunnel visioned. I went to a Jesuit school. I was involved in Jesuit and Ignatian young adult ministry after school, and I've become a Jesuit. And there's a joy to listening to others and to reading about other charisms, because it is this kind of rich undergirding of what can otherwise be seen as a very monolithic church and church community. Once you start kind of sifting through, just noticing difference, and even the charism thing is a kind of way of agglomerating a whole lot of different individuals who are finding their own ways, and some of it will be, for some young people in our schools, it'll be in kind of within the framework of a formal charism, but for others it will be far more individual. I wanted to ask about projects that you've experienced in schools or school systems now or in the past that have been ways of starting to get students to think about their place in the world, but also in the church, that sense of call, individual vocation. Are there particular ways into projects that be they immersion programs or retreat or leadership opportunities that start to get students thinking, that have worked in your experience? Geraldine, do you want to go first again?
Look, I have a bit to do with our Josephite school in Victoria, Mount St. Joseph's, and they have a strong connection to probably the school that Susan's in as well, but it's through a Josephite network. And so the schools who have a Josephite charism all network together, and each year they have like an intensive for the leaders, the student leaders and I think they always have it in Sydney, but I'm not entirely sure about that. But they get together, and I know that the leaders really appreciate that opportunity to get together, and they have a really, I think that they develop a really strong sense of the charism. But my experience was in primary school, so I went to a Josephite primary school, and I don't think it's a particular program. I think it's about the whole experience. So it's about prayer and self-reflection and story and connection to scripture, and I think sayings. Most of our primary school kids who have a Josephite connection would absolutely never see a need without doing something about it. And I think that those sort of little catchy phrases hook into where kids are at. And I think for me, the biggest influence was really the witness of the sisters and the teachers in that, living that Josephite charism. So at a primary level, it's so much about what you're immersed. I think about what you're immersed in, what you're seeing people doing, what you're hearing people saying, how people are treating one another, and what the expectations are around that kind of interaction. So I guess from a Josephite perspective, a lot of it's about how you treat the person sitting next to you, not just how do you see the bigger needs in the world. So when I went to the Brigidine Secondary College, that was more about, get out on the streets and get some political action happening and, you know, social justice and make a big deal. But for my primary setting, it was really very close to who's the person next to you, and how are you with them, and then how do you see people, the teachers, interacting with each other and working with one another. So I think, you know, and then as a system leader, one of the initiatives for our primary and secondary schools was an action research project on charism. So it was really to help schools to actually look at what they, not, you know, any charism that they had, what their charism was, not just Josephite, but all the different charisms, and say, well, what do you, how is that lived out in your school, and do your kids know that? So some of it's, you know, often we have images and statues and representations of the charism in our schools, and the kids walking past them every day don't know what they are. They don't know why they're there, and they don't know what they mean. So part of that, you know, charism action research project is to say, how are you presenting that to the students? So it's not one specific program, but it's actually about how do we live our lives.
Thanks, Geraldine. Susie, some of that Josephite flavour looked like it might have been connecting for you. I wonder, from that experience as a middle school REC, but also working with young people now with diverse needs, how do you sort of draw those connections for students with the identity of a school, and then how they fit within that, and how they think about what contribution they might make?
Yeah.
You turned yourself off, Susan.
It's not the technology, it's me. Yeah, I really love what Geraldine said about, you know, starting with your school community. I know, you know, I've done work with students where, you know, for example, at St. Pat's, I kind of mentored and worked with students in an era for change, which is Edmund Rice Advocacy for Change group, and that was about, you know, teaching students advocacy skills. And so there was advocacy and outreach, which was beautiful. But I really think when it comes down to it, that, you know, that change can start within your community to you know, to just sit and be present with the person next to you. And from an inclusive education teacher point of view, I definitely see that that's important. You know, we might go, oh, we can go and do all these wonderful outreach opportunities when there's so many students in our own schools who are just, you know, wanting the presence of another student, you know, wanting someone to just sit with them at lunch. It's just those little things. Yeah, so yeah, I guess it all starts in your small community. So you can do sort of your big change out in the wide world, as well as, but it's also really important to make sure that we do those things in our own communities as well, and do those things well.
And Nathan, for you, in that context that you've found yourself in, what projects have kind of led students into, or maybe, and I suppose staff too, into conversations about charism and understanding the identity of a particular school community?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I'll echo a few things that Susie just said about even the word presence. You know, it's one of the sort of the characteristics of our spirituality, and we do have a program that's around presence, just on that simple one, and it's led by students for younger students in the primary school. There's some schools, Marist Schools, there's about 55 in Australia. They have, in the playground, they have the poles where the kids are playing handball, have the word presence and simplicity and love of work literally right there in their face. So it's all of that. It's the signs and the symbols. But I think, as Geraldine said before, it's most importantly the people and the relationships where this charism and this spirituality is manifested. I was looking for a better word, transformed or transferred. I don't think quite know how it happens. But yeah, we certainly have lots of programs, and particularly for staff too. We find the staff formation so important to continuing this charism, and we've got programs that run about 5 or 6 times a year for staff from around Australia that come and they explore the charism. And it's particularly the Marist charism, which is situated within the Catholic Church. And, you know, we have a phrase of making Jesus known in love. I'm pretty sure that's the evangelical thrust of every Catholic school, but we make sure that's known. And we also obviously express who we are as Marist. And our staff do know who Marcelin was, and the brothers, and that patronage as well. So, yeah, and I think in our school here in Canberra, there's a lot of work being done beyond the RE classroom across the curriculum areas. And we see each of our staff members, whether they're an RE teacher or a PE teacher, science teacher, they're all invited into these programs that we run so that our children are understanding that faith is across the whole school. I was going to just mention another phrase that we like, and again, it's not owned by Marist, but we're contemplatives in action. Very much something that we've been striving for a long time with our students, to have exactly what the others were saying about social justice and outreach, the action, of course, but that time of reflection and really understanding where that thrust for that service comes from. So yeah, it's always striking that balance. I've always worked in boys' education, so I'm not quite sure what girls' education looks like, but I know our male students love getting their hands dirty and sleeves rolled up. But it's so important that they have that understanding of why they're doing it, and the effect it's having on them, that sense of service and solidarity. So yeah, I think there's just a few of the things that we're doing here for staff and students. I'd say one more thing, sorry, I forgot.
Please.
You reminded me about parents, and in the primary school, we're only just really beginning to work there with our students and realizing how important the parent partnerships are in that space as well. So we've got to learn a lot about how parents can find times and opportunities to also invest their time into service for their kids.
Because for lots of parents, we know coming into a Catholic primary school is the first serious sustained engagement with a church community, maybe with a particular identity for some time prior, not for all by any means, but for many. So it's an important and privileged space to be walking with families, right? And just thinking out, how much is that for each of you, the importance of engaging families in school communities? And that you've talked about the dynamics of the environment, the immediate environment, but getting families on board at any level, how important is that, and how do you do that?
Well, that's a very tricky question, Julian. I think it's essential, and often it's evangelising, because many of the families today are attracted to Catholic education not necessarily because they're connected to the Catholic faith. And I think sometimes we do have to be careful that we don't form them in a particular charism to the detriment of, inviting them into the Catholic Church. So it's a bigger picture than just the school space. And I suppose one of the things that we did in Sandhurst while I was there in Bendigo Diocese was to put our RE curriculum in an open online space with a theological background, so that parents had access to all of that materials if they wanted to. And then, I know that, schools have done things like instigate having a weekly community mass in the evening for, say on a Friday evening, where parish are invited as well, but it's at the school, so that you're kind of meeting the parents somewhere in between. And it's not just in the faith space, Melbourne Archdiocese has certainly done a lot of work in the family school partnerships space and to say, you know, that we know the research shows that kids have better outcomes if their families are involved, not just in canteen and uniform shop and P&F, but actually engaged in the education process, so invited into understanding what's happening educationally for their kids. And I think, you know, essentially the same thing applies in this charism space, this identity space. And, you know, a lot of our younger parents are also kind of on that identity search. You know, they're not really sure who they are or where they fit as well. And I think one of the challenges is that we haven't done in Catholic education a particularly good job at teaching discernment. And you know that there is quite a strong Jesuit influence in the Josephite charism, and I think that discernment is something that all of our kids can learn, you know, and they should start young, but it's certainly, you know, essential in those senior secondary years. And we certainly didn't do it when I was at school. I had to learn that when I left school. But it's so, you know, when we talk about charism, if we're going to work out where the Spirit is calling us, if we don't actually have those skills and understanding of listening to the Spirit and also knowing the movements of the Spirit within ourselves, which is where that self-reflection stuff is so important, then how are we going to identify where God is calling us? So it's, you know, we've included it in our curriculum in the senior school, but I think it should be in, you know, personally, I think it should be in all year levels.
So to sort of come off that, I think really interesting and important point about discernment, Geraldine. Nathan, if I can ask you, moving students into that space of exploring their gifts and their God-given purpose in life, which is the heart of discernment, what am I called to do? How do you sort of start, or what are some of the ways that you can build that into curriculum and practice at school? How do you get that into the classroom or around the classroom in the school environment and build that those conversations?
Yeah, no, I'm just smiling because I'm thinking about the different age students, you know, from in our school context, it's year 4 students to year 12 and post school as well. So I think each of those stages and ages have a different approach to the question you just asked. But I'll just go right in the middle for year 9s. We have a program where the year 9s do a sort of a separate thing for the year, and part of that is service, and they have a day. And one of my favorite stories was I stood up and said, look, boys, you know, these are the things you can get involved in the school. And, you know, if you've got any other ideas, come see me. And, I just threw it out there. I didn't think anybody would. And these boys came up a couple of weeks later and said, well, we've been thinking about what you had to say. And we're really into sport. I thought, okay, well, what's that got to do with service? And I heard them out, and they said, well, actually, you know what we realized is one of our brothers goes to this school for kids with special needs, and they don't get the same access to the sports that we have. So we'd like to start something. And I almost fell off my chair. I thought, well, okay, they've understood exactly what we're talking about. They've seen a need and they're doing something about it. So they were so passionate. And that program, it's still going, 5 or 6 years on, because of those young kids who sort of, really stood up. Our year 11s and 12s, I think we're talking about discernment there, and we started a program, a mentoring program. We called it mentoring, but I'd probably refer to now, it's closer to accompaniment, a little bit intentional, and for boys who are involved in the youth ministry teams in the school. So they've kind of self-selected to go into those. And that's just an opportunity for the catch up with a mentor who's a staff member, and the staff member's trained in how to do that. And some of those relationships continue post-school. And we're really blessed to see these young men really flourishing in all sorts of things in life. To go back to the primary school, as I said, I'm a newbie in that space. So, but I think there's little mini service programs that we're getting going there, and I think they enjoy seeing the older students coming and engaging with them. So I'm looking for ideas. So if you've got ideas for primary school service, put it in the chat.
Susie, to you on that question, what have you seen that sort of worked in terms of connecting students in curriculum or in around curriculum with thinking about their purpose and that deeper or that sort of individual call to how they're meant to live?
Yeah, so I guess, look, I'm just trying to improve. We're working to really sort of do that a little bit more in depth here. And I guess in the context of students with a disability, we certainly like to focus on their strengths. What is it that you can do well? What are the gifts that God's given you? What are the things that you're great at that you feel like you can give back and share that beautiful gift with others? There's lots of opportunities around schools. I love being a part of schools where there is something in at least one aspect of the school that a student will have wonderful success with, so that they can start to really find what their unique gift is. That could be someone could be exceptional in a music program or be a beautiful musician. Someone could be a wonderful sports player and have great success with that post school. And then also your opportunities to explore the charism of the school, where it might be raising funds through a bake sale for a particular cause, or helping run the St Vincent de Paul barbecue, or tutoring students at the primary school next door. So just all of those opportunities. I think those opportunities that happen in the school community start to give students a little taste for what their strengths are, but also how they can use their gifts for the greater good of the people around them.
Geraldine, you sort of led us very nicely into this conversation about discernment. I wonder if you had any further in terms of thoughts on what works for students at any level of getting them involved in asking those questions in a way that's manageable for them, or age and stage appropriate.
Yeah, I think one of the things is really around supporting and encouraging the views that they already hold, and talking about God and religion in a supportive way. So when I did some work around that, as I said, I'm interested in children as theologians, there's quite a bit of writing that says from very young, like preschool age, kids have an expectation that somebody made the world, because everything in the world is made by somebody. And so they have a natural expectation that there is a creator. And often I think what happens is that as they move into more of that kind of teenager age group, they start to lose that because people are not really talking about it as though it's a reality. So they become that, they think, because nobody's talking about it, and because when they were little, they were told there's an Easter bunny and there's Father Christmas, and so they find out that those things aren't real, and then they think, oh, well, so probably God's not real either. So I think it's, we have to think about how do we nurture what's already there. So it's not so much about teaching them about it, it's actually encouraging it and helping them to explore those ideas more, and think about, in the lower primary grades, we have little songs about, there was a lovely one when I first started teaching, I can't see the wind, but I can feel it blow, as clouds rush by in the stormy sky, the wind is there, I know. So it's, there are things I cannot see, and it's around, I can't see God, but I can see God's action. And so making those connections, and Monica Brown had lots of lovely children's songs that really helped to connect kids into that space. And I know, people like Andrew Chin now are doing a similar thing. So if we it's really about nurturing what's already in there, and then helping kids explore. I think I feel really blessed as a teenager. My dad had been in the YCW, and so he had grown up with, See, Judge, Act, and all of that Cardine stuff. So when I got to a stage of, this is probably not real, I had an adult to dialogue with, so that when I said, well, this is rubbish, then he was able to actually question that and come back with what he thought about it. And I think if we have along, for some time, if people are not comfortable in that dialogical religious education space, for the movement from grade 5 to year 9 and beyond, then there's no one for young people to really explore those ideas with. And so you want them to actually question and think about, well, how do we know, I know this, but how do I know it? How do other people sense and feel the same thing, or am I just bonkers, But certainly present in little kids, and particularly, that whole, the gift of awe and wonder, just hang around with a 3-year-old for a while. I did that on the weekend, and my goodness, it's just the best experience, because they just experience, they're full of the Spirit. So I could go on with that all night.
Yeah, as you told you, I in my first couple of years as a Jesuit spent time as part of a parish catechetics team going to state primary schools, and it sort of struck me then, and I still reflect on, particularly given experiences now working with adolescents in a couple of school environments, just how much those kids were keen for and engaged by the content and by the questions in a really interesting way, but also how much those kind of, even though they were for, in a sense, known only to that group, but this sort of cultural markers that we sing this together, or that we have this particular practice together, that was meeting a need that they had for community and for, trying to approach these big questions or these big assumptions that they have. Nathan, by the time you get to adolescence, there can be a real spectrum, and you've talked about programs that work for students who are really engaged and who are wanting to go deeper. How do you kind of differentiate kind of content, particularly in classes where everyone's got to be there, so that you're engaging those kids who sustain interest and maybe are in households where they're sort of getting lots of the building blocks, so they kind of get the context and all of that, along with kids who are from backgrounds where they're not getting so much and they're not really interested? How do you kind of try and hold everyone?
It's a great question. I was just thinking back to, we'll get to your answer, but just think about my own daughter in the car trips to school each morning. And you're absolutely right about the theologians as children. I'm stumped often with the questions that come out of the back seat. I think, oh my goodness. And yeah, I was thinking about that. Michelangelo's got those prisoners, those sculptures that are sort of trying to emerge out of the marble. And he said that the statue's actually within the marble itself before. And I think that's a nice analogy for forming young people, forming people at all, that God is within them, and it's the role of the teacher, the educator, the parent to just slightly chip away. And I think, my experience with younger people is there's not as much marble on the outside, but by the time they get to year 7, it's really starting to build up. You have to take a jackhammer to it sometimes, and other times really gentle. And I think you're right, like in the year 7 RE classroom, you've got the full spectrum. And I think the challenge of an RE teacher, any teacher really, is to know each of those children individually and to get a sense of who they are, and that they have a real belief that you respect where they're at and that you're meeting them there. And you're not going to, your job isn't to sort of open up the head and pour in the faith, or because there can be resistance to that, you know, and I don't know whether it's just an assumption that's what RE is going to be like, or it's actually happened. And yeah, I think it's important that RE educators do take the approach that we've been talking about. It's very important. And in terms of differentiating, I think there's some really lovely programs that do help those kids who want to go a little bit further. And at our school, they kick in around year 8, year 9, and year 8, I think it's getting involved in the liturgy class, and it's a slow way in. And honestly, we have all sorts of kids enrolling in that class, and they're not all your weekend Sunday Catholics, I'll tell you. So, you know, I think there's opportunities to pick up kids along the way, and you just create entry points and obviously invite as much as you can. So yeah, I think that answers it the best I can.
Susan, you talked before about the importance of engaging students' particular strengths. I wonder if you'd just say a bit more about how that might play out in engaging students in RE curriculum, and, you know, practical things that help get them engaged, and, you know, particularly, you know, students with diverse learning needs, and making sure that the classroom's inclusive, but also, you know, engaging, I suppose.
Yeah, you've really got to meet kids with where they're at, and you've got to be current and know, you know, what the current trends are. I like to always ask students, you know, how they best learn as well, to sort of think about, well, what might that look like, you know, for the next term as well. But yeah, definitely. I think, you know, in terms of engaging students in the religious education classroom, sometimes you do have to be creative. You know, I've seen stuff where the Minecraft education's being used in a religious education classroom, and, you know, that's an amazing way to engage, you know, boys, but also, yeah, a range of students. Yeah, and then in terms of meeting the diverse needs of learners, probably out of all the subjects that you'd study in a Catholic school, religious education should be the most inclusive of that. Yeah, definitely. You want every student to have a positive association with religious education, but also being respectful of different beliefs in the classroom as well. I know I always love it when the atheist in the classroom says, put up the hand straight away, it's day 1, term 1, I'm an atheist, miss. And so that's great. You're going to add so much value to our discussions as we go through the year. Also love, you know, when you have students of different faiths in the classroom and sharing their faiths. It just adds to a beautiful, rich diversity in the classroom, where everyone feels welcomed and everyone feels a part of that classroom. Yeah, but look, honestly, from my experience, one of the best ways I've seen young men engaged in a RE classroom, I used to, Brother Chris Pritchard is at St. Patrick's College, and I used to ask him to come into some of my classrooms just to talk about, for example, it might be, there might be a focus on Mary as part of an RE unit. So he would come in and do a big talk about it. And every student in the class was silent, and they were totally captivated just by his presence and his knowledge. You know, having those connections in your school just adds to the richness of an RE curriculum as well.
Right. And just an invitation. We've got about 10 minutes to go, just to those who have joined us. If you've got a question or a comment or an idea that you'd like to stick in the chat, that would be great, and we might come to it. The last sort of question from me is just that the sort of pointy end of life choices, how much in schools do you talk about concretely what it might look like for your life, maybe in terms of, married life or religious life or priesthood? How much in terms of the discussion about charism does kind of personal choice, which often now is further and further away from someone leaving the classroom, come up in conversation in a school setting that you've experienced? And is it helpful? What are the ways that it can be done well? What are the ways that maybe less of the ways that don't work and more of the ways that do? But or what are some of the pitfalls that you might avoid?
Well, I think in the past we probably had like specific vocations lessons, even in primary school. Not just religious vocations, but using that terminology around where are you being called, what's your purpose in life, and what are you going to do. But I'm not sure. I think now we think more around probably in our secondary curriculum, more around mission and ministry. So like thinking about how are we active in living God's mission, the good news, and then we don't really. I don't know that we really specifically explore lifestyles as such, and equally, I'm not sure that age group is the time to do it either. Like I think that's a question for young adults, post school. And perhaps some of the less helpful aspects of religious life came about because of juniораtes and people being encouraged into vocations really at an age when they hadn't had the life experience that could enrich their lives in that vocation. So I think we have to be careful about the way that we frame and look at that kind of specific calling. So I think in school it's probably more helpful, and I think Nathan even said he had a smorgasbord of charisms to choose from, and I think that's important. I think it's at primary and secondary school age to be able to see and find out and hear about lots of different ways of living in the Spirit is good.
Susan, to you, are there good ways into this kind of more concrete conversation?
Yeah, I guess I know I have taught, where we explore vocations in religion, and there's often, really good discussion around that with students and giving them the opportunity. I always love when you have vocations. The vocations team will come to a careers expo and have a little stand there. I think that's a beautiful thing and a beautiful presence. But in terms of how we do that in schools, I know I've taught young men who have gone on to do some preparation or do that year discernment, for the priesthood, and you think, wow, that's extremely powerful, when that happens, but you don't know if that's their family or was that their experience at the school. It's a hard one. I guess with anything, you think, maybe it might be approaching young people more directly one-on-one by inviting them. Excuse me, have you individually thought about this as a way of life, or this as a vocation? That might be the best way to get young people to think, where am I going with my life?
Nathan, to you on that one.
Yeah, look, I was very curious about the conversation. I do a bit of work in the vocations area for lay Marist vocations, and I was just, listening. I agree with everything that you've both said, and I think formation's about, like, vocation is about flourishing, isn't it? Like it's about being your best self and learning who that is in life. And I think we do that through our relationships. And something that our school is currently just embarking on is we call it a respectful relationships project. We can't think of a better name for it, but it's much broader than consent education and any of that. Of course, that's important, but it's about, I wouldn't say setting our kids up for life, because they're still doing it right now as they're students, and at each stage of life, it'll grow. But I think some of those relationships that we'd like to see our students engage in is with, all sorts of people. And I think you just said that outside of the Marist charism, of course. And we haven't had a Marist brother come out of the school, or a young man become a Marist brother since I've been here, but we have had 3 or 4 priests, and that's a real blessing. But I think for me, like, I'm a married man, and there's a young guy that just messaged me about something the other day and told me he has 4 children. And I think, how can that be? He's younger than me. I taught the man, and but there was a real joy, real flourishing in his life just from this simple message. And I think that's what we're trying to do in the Catholic education game. And as Geraldine said, I think those decisions and the accompaniment post school so important. And I think in the Marist world, we're working on it. But I think in the church, the parish, and Geraldine, you said it before, like, you don't graduate the church when you graduate school. We don't want our families kind of doing the same thing either. And I think that's why the parent partnerships and parish thing's so important to me, because we've got an opportunity, but it's not just while they're at the school. I think it's a lifelong thing. Yeah.
Well, thanks to each of you, Geraldine, Nathan, and Susan. I'm going to pass back to Michelle, I think, for a final word.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time and your insights. The video will be available in coming days on, if you'd like to share it with others, staff at your school. Yes, and we'll upload your attendance to the TAPS platform, the ones that have. And we'll just finish with a quick prayer. So, Heavenly King, be with us as we close this meeting. May everyone be enlightened and the things discussed during this meeting be observed. All these things we pray in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for your time.